They called it a removal. But it was not that. It was exile. It was suffering. It was death wrapped in the cloak of law. In 1838, more than 16,000 members of the Cherokee Nation were forcibly removed from their ancestral lands and forced to march over 1,000 miles. Men, women, children, the elderly. Entire families, driven from the homes their ancestors had lived in for generations. The world would later name this tragedy the Trail of Tears. But for those who walked it, it was the trail of betrayal, of shattered identity, of silent graves and stolen futures. Before the United States existed, the Cherokee thrived in the southeastern region of what is now Georgia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Alabama. They had their own language, their own constitution, a system of laws, and even a newspaper written in the Cherokee syllabary. They farmed, they governed, they educated. They had built schools, churches, towns. Many wore European-style clothing and converted to Christianity. To outsiders, they were called the civilized tribe. But to the U.S. government and the settlers eyeing their land, they were simply in the way. In 1828, everything changed. Gold was discovered on Cherokee land in Georgia. Suddenly, their forests and rivers, once sacred, were worth their weight in greed. White settlers rushed in like a tide of hunger, and the pressure on the government grew. President Andrew Jackson, a man both worshipped and condemned in American history, had already set the stage. In 1830, he signed the Indian Removal Act, a law that allowed the U.S. to negotiate treaties to relocate native tribes west of the Mississippi. But for the Cherokee, it wasn't a negotiation. It was an ultimatum. They resisted. Peacefully, they took their case to the U.S. Supreme Court in Worcester v. Georgia, and won. Chief Justice John Marshall declared that the Cherokee Nation was a sovereign entity, and the state of Georgia had no authority over their lands. Legally, the Cherokee were right. But in practice, power spoke louder than law. President Jackson famously dismissed the ruling, reportedly saying, "John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it." The government found a loophole. In 1835, a small, unauthorized group of Cherokee signed the Treaty of New Echota, agreeing to relocation in exchange for land and money. But the vast majority of the Cherokee people opposed it. They hadn't voted for it. They hadn't approved it. It was a betrayal from within, signed by a few, used by many. By May 1838, under orders from President Martin Van Buren, 7,000 U.S. soldiers descended upon Cherokee territory. They came with rifles, bayonets, chains. They tore families from their homes at gunpoint. Children screamed as soldiers stormed into villages. Mothers begged. Elders wept. There was no mercy. No time to gather belongings. Some were forced to leave with only the clothes on their backs. They were placed in overcrowded internment camps, holding pens surrounded by disease, filth, and fear. Many died there before the march even began. And then, as autumn turned to winter, the forced journey west began. Over 1,000 miles. On foot. Through mountains, rivers, freezing rains, and blistering sun. With little food. No shelter. And no rest. They marched during snowstorms. In torn clothing. Some barefoot. Many sick. Others pregnant. The U.S. Army allowed no delays. Even as people collapsed from exhaustion or fever, the march continued. Children froze to death in their mothers' arms. Elders were buried in shallow, unmarked graves along the roadside. Entire families were decimated before they even reached Indian territory. An estimated 4,000 Cherokee died during the removal, nearly 1 in 4. But the real number may be higher. Disease, starvation, hypothermia, grief, these were their companions on the trail. And yet, their suffering was met not with sympathy, but silence. To the U.S. government, it was a success. Land had been cleared. Treaties had been honored. The frontier was now open to white settlers. But to the Cherokee, it was a wound that never healed. Their removal wasn't just physical. It was spiritual, emotional, a deep tearing apart of identity, culture, and connection. They called it Nunadal Tsuni, the trail where they cried. And they cried not only for the dead, but for the betrayal of promises. For the land that held their ancestors' bones. For the sacred rivers, the songs lost in the wind, the traditions broken by force. This was not relocation. This was cultural annihilation dressed up as diplomacy. Yet, somehow, the Cherokee survived. Those who made it to Oklahoma rebuilt their lives. They formed schools again, re-established government, and passed down the stories, the real stories, so the next generation would never forget. So that we would never forget. Because history, when ignored, repeats itself. And justice, when silenced, becomes a myth. Today, the Trail of Tears is remembered not as a distant past, but as a brutal reminder of how governments can erase with laws, how power can blind even democracy, and how a people, no matter how civilized, educated, or peaceful, can still be destroyed by those who refuse to see their humanity. What would you do if someone came to your home and told you, you don't belong anymore? What if everything you knew, your history, your future, was signed away without your voice? Would you cry? Would you fight? Or would you walk, like they did? This wasn't just a trail. It was a graveyard, a memory, and a warning. And its tears still fall